Tonight, in our third installment of Matthew 24, we're going to begin down in verse 23. And so, what we saw was this is a text that's notoriously difficult to interpret. And some of the questions result from what is it exactly that the apostles were asking? What is the scope of the answer that Jesus gives to that which they are asking? And is this about the final judgment only? Some think that. Is this about the destruction of Jerusalem only? Some think that. Is this about both the final judgment and about the destruction of Jerusalem? And we're going to get in passages tonight in which people often interpret as the end of the world, but I don't think we've got there yet in this text. I do think we are going to get to the end of the world in our teaching here from Jesus in this chapter. And I don't think once he switches over to the end of the world, he switches back and forth. Some think he switches back and forth, and that makes it real confusing as to where you make the slices of one or the other. Although the parables of judgment in Matthew 25 do seem to have just as good nearly an application to one judgment as the other. And that might be because one judgment typifies the other, or there's just such a commonality when God brings big judgments. In either case, what we'll know is that Jesus does speak about judgment, does speak about what happens when there is unrighteousness that continues in the world, that God will deal with that. So we can have that surety as an absolute certainty. So we began in the first verses of Matthew 24, where Jesus let the apostles know. He said that, do you see these things, the temple and the buildings around? He said, I truly say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, but all will be torn down. And a little bit later, up on the Mount of Olives, they asked him, saying, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so the destruction of the temple, the coming of Jesus, and the end of the age. I think they saw that if the temple goes away, we've entered a new age, at least. We've entered a new time. And so it was in the old covenant. It was a new time when they built the temple. It was a new time when the first one got knocked down, and it was a new time when the second one got rebuilt. And so they're looking for something very different if this temple goes away. They knew that if the temple goes away, we're into a new age now, and it had to be a very great change. And they knew there'd be a temple, like the last third of a book of Ezekiel speaks in prophecy about this great temple that is going to come. And so for this temple to go away, maybe that would usher in the new temple. It's going to be a new age. So when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So Jesus then told them about things that would mislead them. Let no one mislead you, for many will come in my name, and many will say, I am the Christ, and mislead many. Then he talked about the persecutions that were going to come, but God would deliver them. And he talked about the dangers of falling away by following religious error or by losing your faith through all these things. But then he made a promise that the gospel would progress to the whole world before these things came. Then in verse 15, we started with the abomination of desolations, in which Jesus then explained the things of which Daniel said were going to come. It would be a great tribulation, the likes of which had never been seen from the beginning of the world till now. And we talked about the terrible suffering when Jerusalem was destroyed. And we saw that the terrible times were going to come, and this system was going to end. So now we start fresh tonight in verse 23, Matthew 24 and verse 23. And what we're going to find is there is a false hope that people would have, but every hope that's not going to be built directly on God, we're going to see is going to be crushed. And so this is going to be a judgment because people rejected the will of God. They rejected the way of God. They rejected the things that he said. He wanted to save them. He offered to save them. He sent them the Messiah to save them. but they kept rejecting him. And so the rejection now is going to come to them. So, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets, Jesus had said before, and stones those sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks, but you were unwilling. So when this judgment comes, there's going to be no escape. The only escape is going to be to do what Jesus said, which is to get out of this city. That's going to be the only escape. He had sent them so many different ways to escape, but they had rejected it. So all kind of false hope will be crushed. So Matthew 24:23. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. Literally, it just says, don't believe. What's the great thing we're supposed to do with Jesus? Believe, right? Unless you believe that I am, you'll die in your sin. So when it comes to Jesus, the text says, believe. But when it comes to anybody not Jesus, Jesus says, do not believe. Don't believe those things. Verse 24, for false Christ and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. So it's going to be hard times. And evidently, some of these guys are going to be very convincing. And the people who are with Jesus, some of them are going to be tempted maybe to follow these things, or maybe to believe that Jesus has come back, or Jesus is here or there. And in times of distress, people will believe many things. And so like in the book of Acts in chapter 8, Simon the sorcerer had deceived many people, claiming he was the great power of God. Well, in these times of troubles, here come people like that who people are going to believe. Josephus records before Jerusalem was destroyed, there was a man who led a large group into the wilderness, and he told everybody that he was going to part the Jordan River, just like Joshua had when he led the people into the promised land. Of course, he got them all there gathered by the river, which didn't part, and it made it easy for the Romans to round them up and kill them all because they were all in one spot and they had no place to retreat because they were down there by the river. And there was another one who claimed to be the Messiah, and Josephus records that that man had 30,000 followers. So there's all these false Christs appearing, and one of the reasons for that is what we studied in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, in the prophecy of the 70 weeks, we're able to pretty well see how that exactly fits the time frame of Jesus. And the events that happened before the coming of Jesus fit exactly the things that led up to the Maccabean rebellion. And then came a rebellious king right after that. And then would come the Messiah. And just as we do today, looking back at history, saying, well, that's Antiochus IV, and that's the ceasing of the sacrifices by his oppression at the temple, and this next king that comes along, that's Herod. You know, we're not the only ones who can do that. The Jews at that time, they had the same book. They had Daniel too, and they knew that something was coming. And so there was this great messianic fervor in the early first century, and then you think about when the Magi show up and say, hey, we're come here to worship the king. Everybody knew that. When John the Baptist shows up and now we've got prophets in the land again, everybody knew that. And so there were many who had the idea the Messiah is going to come. And we know from the Gospels that there were a lot of people who thought the Messiah was going to come as a political Messiah. The Messiah was going to come like the Maccabees did, and he's going to throw off the Romans, and he's going to fight the power, and he's going to lead the Jews to political freedom. And there's a lot of Jews like the Zealots who wanted that kind of thing. And there's others who, and like we know for a fact from the writings of the Essenes, that group that was down by the Dead Sea, who we've now recovered of some of their documents, we know that they were looking for a Messiah, but not a leader who would lead an army, but they were looking for the great teacher to come. Of course, we recognize the great teacher came. The great teacher was amongst them, and somehow they missed it. And so there was a lot of people looking for the Messiah. We've also found now through the more recent scholarship has seen in first century and the century before, so the 2 centuries on either side of Christ, there was a great expectation among the Jewish people of the Messiah, and sometimes not even just a Messiah, but there's such broad ranging prophecies about the Messiah that a lot of people thought it's going to take several people to fulfill all these prophecies. So there's going to be a priest Messiah, and there's going to be a king Messiah, and maybe there's going to be an army leader Messiah, and there's going to be these instructor Messiah. And so they thought maybe these guys would come as a team, and they would each do their role, and they'd lead the Jewish people to the place where they wanted to be. And so as these things come, Jesus says to his followers, I'm the one. You believed in me. Do not believe in any of these others. Do not believe. And so, verse 25, which sounds pretty ominous, behold, I've told you in advance. So I'm telling you, I'm letting you know clearly and fully and completely. None of these other things, none of these other false Christs or these false prophets, even if they show signs and wonders, again, like Simon the sorcerer had done, none of these people are to be followed. None of these people are to be believed. If therefore they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, don't go out there. Don't even bother. Behold, he's in the inner room. Don't believe him. So if he's out in some other place, don't go over there. If he's in some secret place and they got the key to unlock the secret and they'll lead you to the right place, don't believe that either. It's not going to be. And so verse 27, for just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, there's 2 points about lightning that we might make, and it's some have tried to explain this passage with either one of these 2 points, and one is with the speed of lightning, and we use that as a common figure of speech, how fast lightning comes. I don't think that's it. I think rather it's the obviousness of lightning. When there's a big, huge lightning strike, who knows it? Everybody. It's obvious. And so I think that's what he means here by the lightning that flashes from the east to the west. I don't necessarily think it's about the direction. I don't think it's about the suddenness. I don't think it's about that. I think what it's about is the absolute obviousness of it. So it's not in a secret room. It's in a lightning that lights up the sky. There's verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will be gathered. Now, my translation says vultures. The King James, the New King James, and the American Standard, they all say eagles. Now, I know we like to think about our eagle as a grand and majestic and noble bird, the most noble of all the birds. We're not the only ones to think that. The Roman legions, they marched under the eagles as well. And also the Russians. The Russians have the two-headed eagle as their national symbol. So we're not the only ones with an eagle. But one thing about the eagle is, what does the eagle eat? Pretty much everything. They'll eat the fresh stuff, and so pictures of the bald eagles diving into Alaskan rivers or Alaskan lakes to get the fish. It's a noble and beautiful picture. What's not quite so noble, but is actually just about as common, or maybe even more so, is the eagles that are just waiting around for something to die. And eagles will eat the dead stuff, just like vultures will. Now, they'll eat other stuff too. And so you can see some very unromantic pictures, especially from town of Homer, Alaska, where because of the federal protections, the bald eagle population has just absolutely exploded. And there are these pictures of bald eagles just hanging out at dumpsters, just to pick up whatever kind of dead stuff there is to eat around the dumpster. Now, that doesn't make the pages of National Geographic, does it? It doesn't. It kind of goes against our image. But the idea here that some translations say vultures and some translations say eagles, honestly, it's not that far apart. And it's not so much as we might like to think in our patriotic view, especially of the bald eagle. But the vulture gathers around the dead, and the standards on the Roman eagle, the Roman eagle standards that led the legions, those surrounded Jerusalem. And so whichever one it is, vultures or eagles. It works out just the same either way, and the message is the same. Because where did the vultures gather? At Jerusalem. Where did the eagles gather? At Jerusalem. And so whichever one of those words you want to go with, it's the same. The location is the same. The legions marched at Jerusalem. The vultures gathered where the dead were. And so the sins of men bring judgment. I think there's a bit of play on words there in Matthew 28, and I think that's, 24, verse 28. Verse 28 has a bit of play on words, which I think is maybe why the translations don't all agree, because plays on words don't translate well. But in either case, the location is certainly Jerusalem in this case, because that's where the sin is, that's where the stink is, that's where the judgment is going to be centered. And in either case, Jesus had already made the same point back in Luke 17 in a similar discourse when he said, Luke 17:37, they answered and said to him, "Where, Lord?" And he said, "Where the body is, there will be the vultures." So they would be familiar with him saying that. So when this destruction comes, of which Jesus has spoken, and we looked at last week in some of the details of is it 600,000 who died? Is it 1,000,000 who died? The suffering in the city. They end up having a multi-way civil war. The other day I saw a documentary on the destruction of Jerusalem, and it talked about how one group of people controlled one part of the city, one controlled another, one group, a third different group controlled the temple complex. And so you have a civil war going on inside of a siege city. And it was just absolutely terrible. And all this came as judgment. And this judgment is described in language so harsh and in language so vivid that many people think it is literally about the end of the world. Now, I don't think it's literally about the end of the world yet. We will still get there, but not yet. But Luke 21:25, and then we'll go back to Matthew 24. Luke 21:25, there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and upon the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the seas and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, where the powers of heaven will be shaken. Now that, if you're not familiar with the type of language, that could sound an awful lot like end of the world. Or Matthew 24:29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and glory. And so there's two things here that give people the indication we're already at the end of the world. I don't think we are, although I have to say, if you make the order of things, after the tribulation, then comes the Son of Man, that's a possibility. But if this is about destruction of Jerusalem, then I don't think that the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds is the end of the world, because after the destruction of Jerusalem, how long has it been and the world ain't ended yet? And so, yeah, if some people put all of these things as a coming future great tribulation, and then right after the great tribulation, then will come the end. I'm sorry, I mean the rapture, then a while, then the end. But that's where people make these things try to be future, because if you go with what some people view as the order of things, it doesn't seem to fit. I don't think there's such a big separation between the great tribulation that's coming there and the recognition that this is the work of God, that this is the hand of God and the judgment of God. But also, when people see the talk about the Messiah of Jesus coming in the clouds and coming on the clouds of the sky with power and glory, they automatically think end of the world. Now, I have to say, again, that's not completely unwarranted, because how's the Lord going to return? What do we sing in our hymn? He's coming in the clouds one day, right? And that's right from 1 Thessalonians 4. But the reason I don't think, even though that has similarity to the final judgment, that is the final judgment, is because all through the Old Testament, and this is an extension of this type of language and prophecy, all through the Old Testament, this kind of language is about national judgment. It's national judgment all the time in the Old Testament. Here are some examples. There's, I think, in all 15 or 20 of these type things, but we'll just look at a couple representative examples. When the kingdom of Israel was going to come to an end, so the 10 lost tribes are about to become the lost ones. This is Amos chapter 8, verse 7. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob. Indeed, I will never forget any of their deeds. Because of this, will not the land quake, and everyone who dwells in it mourn? Indeed, all of it will rise up like the Nile. It'll be tossed about and subside like the Nile of Egypt. It'll come about on that day, declares the Lord. Then I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will make the earth dark in broad daylight. Well, that just sounds like this. And then I will turn your festivals to mourning, and your songs to lamentation. I will bring sackcloth to everyone's loins, and baldness on every head. And I will make it like the time of mourning for an only son, and the end of it will be a bitter day. Well, there we have again the sun going at noon and the earth dark in the middle of the day. That's exactly what we're reading here, isn't it? Now, maybe you think, well, that's kind of the same, but it's a little tenuous. How about another one as we go? Isaiah 13, the destruction of Babylon. We know it's about Babylon because it says so. Isaiah 13:1, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. So Isaiah says it is Babylon. Verse 6, wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. And they will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will rise like a woman in labor, and they will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. He will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellation will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Well, that's when Babylon falls. The stars won't give off light. The sun will be dark when it comes up, and there'll be no light from the moon. And that was the end of Babylon. The end of Egypt. Ezekiel chapter 32. We'll read from verse 5. That says verse 7 on the chart, but we'll read from Ezekiel 32, beginning in verse 5. Son of man, take up a lamentation over the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and say to him, you compare yourself to a young lion of the nation, yet you are like the monster of the sea. You burst forth into your rivers and muddied the waters with your feet. You fouled the rivers. I will also make this land drink of the discharge of your blood. As for the mountains and the ravines, they'll be full of you. When I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining light in heaven I will darken over you, and I will set darkness on your head, declares the Lord God. I will also trouble the hearts of many peoples when I bring destruction on the nations into lands which they haven't known. So there again, dark skies, dark sun, dark moon, dark stars. One more, a prior destruction of Jerusalem. Joel chapter 2. This is quoted in the New Testament in Matthew here and quoted in the book of Acts. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon turned to blood, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it will come about that whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be delivered. And from Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape. as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. And that was about a prior destruction of Jerusalem. And since it fits so well, that's why it's quoted again with this destruction of Jerusalem. So in all of them, the moon darkened or turned to blood. The skies darkened. The sun's darkened. The stars are darkened. It's all hyperbolic language to describe the end of the end of their world. It's not the end of the whole world. It's the end of their world. It's about the only fitting language to describe the end of a nation or a system. It's about the only thing to describe the terror that comes when God's judgment comes. And a few years ago, just to make the point of this kind of language and its effectiveness, and it's really the only kind of language that is effective, apocalyptic language made a brief comeback in American country music. Alan Jackson had a song about September 11th. And he asked the question, where were you when the world did what? When the world stopped turning. On September 11th, did the world stop turning? If we had out our measurement equipment and we timed the length of the day, if we timed the rotational speed of the earth, or did any other kind of literalistic and mechanistic measurements, what would it look like that day as far as the amount of light, the amount of lumens from the sun, or the speed of the earth, or the length of the day? It would have all been the same. But still, it's a day, isn't it? It's a different day. It's the day the world stopped turning. And then a couple of years later, and maybe not quite that long, another country music star, and I think it's Toby Keith on this one, the great prophet of the people, Toby Keith. He used a very apocalyptic type language when he talked about the Statue of Liberty shaking her fist at people. Right? Some of us might remember that song as well. And so that is apocalyptic language. When the Statue of Liberty shakes her fist at you, and when the world wasn't turning anymore, that's a big deal. That's a shock to the system, and that's what this language is. That's what the language to describe the destruction of Jerusalem is, both times. When it happened with Nebuchadnezzar, and when it happened with the Roman legions. When it happened to Egypt, when it happened to Babylon, when it happened to Israel. That is the kind of language that's used. And honestly, what other kind of language would you use? I don't know. I don't know how else that it is that you would say these things. And so when those days come, you don't have a lot of choice in what to do except to bow down to God. There is no, when, like it says to the Egyptians, when we're going to fill up the valleys with you, when the stars are coming after you, when everything is wrong, there's only one thing to do, and that is flee to God. Psalm 9, the Lord will be our stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Or Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. And also Psalm 91, I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. And so that's what these days are for. These days are to determine who depends on God and who depends on things of this world. Who's going to have their army save them, their wealth save them, their strongholds that they built in the side of the rock, in the desert places, or the strongholds they built out in the countryside, the country estates they want to go flee to. Today, the nuclear bunkers they've made into luxury condos where they can ride out any troubles that come, or having enough gold to survive the collapse of your currency, or having enough food stashed away in your basement that you can survive when the markets are out of food and there's nothing to buy. When you put your hope in these things. That when God sends a judgment like this, it just won't matter. You won't have enough stockpiled. You won't have enough security when God sends the judgment to your nation. So verse 30 here in Matthew 24. And when then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Again, people think that's the end of the world. No, it's judgment. It's the end of their world, not the end of the whole world. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. The tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the cloud with great power and glory. Again, go back to the Old Testament. You'll find this language used of national judgment. Isaiah 19, the oracle concerning Egypt. So we know what this is, Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud, and he's about to come to Egypt. Well, that ain't good. What's going to happen? The idols of Egypt will tremble in his presence. The heart of the Egyptians will melt. And we think about in these things, what did Daniel see in Daniel 7? I kept looking in night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven was one like the Son of Man coming. He came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And so, yes, Jesus comes on the cloud. Jehovah comes on the cloud. It is the language of judgment. Of course, there is a parallel to the final judgment because the Lord's going to come in the cloud. Now, he's going to welcome his own. He's going to raise the dead. And then when they're safely out of the way, what's he going to do? He's going to lower the boom. And where are you going to hide? Only for those who have their strength and their refuge in God. And so in this case, those who have hoped in God will be preserved. Verse 31. He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, again, there are those who think this is the resurrection at the final judgment. And there's some parallels, but I don't think contextually this fits. I think this is about the angels calling his people to muster, because they sound the trumpet and his people show up from all quarters, and then he leads them to safety. And of course, what happened when they came to destroy Jerusalem? Yeah, the Christians got out. In Matthew 21, verse 28, Matthew 21:28, there's a parallel there to this passage, and it sounds a lot more temporal than it does in Matthew. The parallel is Luke 21:28. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your head, because your redemption is drawing near. And so this is the vindication. This is the redemption of the Christians. The Christians were not harmed in this judgment. That's what history attests to, because they listened to the voice of the Lord to leave that sinking ship, to leave that place where judgment was coming and wrath was going to be poured out. If you knew the spot where wrath was going to be poured out, what would you do when you saw wrath coming? You get away from that spot. What did the Christians do with Jerusalem? They got away from that spot. And so he tells them, stay strong, stay with me. Don't believe those false messiahs we already saw, but stay with me and have confidence, because this is your salvation. Now, again, I think the reason why we can tell this is not the very end of all things, the very end of the world, is because Jesus here gives another time indication. And the time indication that he says is a thing that's pretty close. And what was close, what was proximate to these people's experience? What does history say? Was the end of the world close and proximate? Or was the destruction of Jerusalem close and proximate? Well, one was 40 years away, and the other was just so far 2,000 years away. Now, maybe, 1930 and counting, or 1970, and counting. So one's proximate, and he tells us the time here is near. So learn the parable of the fig tree. Verse 32. When the branch has already become tender, and it puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so you, when you see these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. So when the shoots come off on the leaves, or when the shoots come out of the end of the branch, when the leaves come, you know it's about summertime. So it's just, I have one real sure way of telling when we're done around here with cold weather. if my pecan tree has budded a leaf, we're not going to have another freeze. And I think in my life since I've been paying attention, my pecan trees have only led me wrong about one time ever out of uh, 27, 28 years, however long it's been. All right, 27. Anyway, it's maybe a little longer than that. But anyway, in the years I've been looking, in the years of my life, since I learned that, it's been well proven. If the pecan tree's budded, we're not going to have a frost. Jesus says here, when the fig tree puts out the leaf, it's going to be summertime. And so he says, look, folks, the leaves are coming out. That's the lesson here. The leaves are coming out. Verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, what's happened to that generation? The generation Jesus spoke to, that generation has come, and that generation has long, long, long gone. And has the end of the world taken place yet? No. And so I think, even though there are some verses right up before this, there are some verses that we've studied so far in Matthew 24 that are almost easier to explain as end of the world than to go back and look at all these contexts and all this history and the use of hyperbolic and apocalyptic language. It's almost easier in some of these to say, yeah, that's obviously the end of the world. But Jesus says it's not. And so I'll let him interpret this for us, that this generation is going to see the things I've been talking about. So that's why I think up till now we've been firmly in the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus said we're not changing our mind about that. Because there are times when God promised a judgment, but there was still a condition on it, that if you repented, it would be spared. And there were some folks spared at the very last minute. Wasn't Jerusalem spared even though the armies surrounded it at times? Sennacherib's army, the 185,000 who are slain by an angel. And where are they slain by an angel at? Within sight of the walls of Jerusalem. God spared Jerusalem at the very last minute. And over, God spared them like plucking a brand out of a fire, right? Pulling that, God has pulled them out of the fire when they're a stick already on fire, right? And he blew off the part that was on fire, and he saved what little bit was left, and he made that grow into a nice new and good tree. And so what might they be hoping? Okay, well, I know he said judgment's coming, but you know what? We could straighten up. There's time. There's hope. What does Jesus say? There's no change in this one. This one's coming. There can be no escape. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. There is no change. There is no reprieve on this one. This one is coming. Now, at this point, what did Jesus introduce into the conversation? Heaven and earth passing away. And so it's my understanding, my best explanation of this passage is up until Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. He's been talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But now that he's brought up the idea of heaven and earth passing away, what do you think we'll talk about now? So now I think we're going to switch gears, and now I think we're going to talk about the final judgment. Now, the plan is, Lord willing, to talk about this next week. Now, what might get in the way? Well, the final judgment. The Lord might come before we get to it next week, or maybe there'll be more disease or something. I don't know. So, Lord willing, next week, we'll take it up in verse 36, where he says, but of that day and hour. Of what day and hour? When heaven and earth pass away. Then we'll talk about that. So, we've had the destruction of Jerusalem. We had a lot about it. We've had 35 verses about it. But now we're going to switch, knowing the certainty of that judgment. Because when Jesus said it, it's going to come, right? When Jesus said it, it's going to come. How do we know he hears our prayers? He's promised. How do we know he cares? How do we know we're forgiven? How do we know what matters? How do we know what to do in the church? How do we know in all kinds of things? How do we know how to treat one another? How do we know who to believe in? All these things Jesus has said. And what Jesus says isn't going to pass away. But this whole world will. And next time, we'll talk about that.